President Trump snubs guns in his State of the Union speech. Plus, FBI files show Jeffrey Epstein fought to get his gun rights restored despite his felony sex crime conviction. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. To kick things off for us this week, we just wrapped up the State of the Union address this past Tuesday, where President Trump broke his own record for the longest State of the Union address, coming up around two hours long. And in that whole, long span of speaking about various, trying to highlight the economy and talking about fraud and some foreign policy, one thing that was conspicuously absent was just about any mention whatsoever of gun policy.
Yeah, literally not a mention of it. And it reminds me, at least, probably you and perhaps some of our audience, of the last time President Trump gave a record-setting long major speech, which was at the RNC, the convention. His acceptance speech was also a record-long acceptance speech. So it's a tendency he clearly has. But another tendency is that he doesn't mention gun policy at all in these speeches anymore, these major speeches, which is certainly notable, I think, right? And which I think is primarily a sign of where he puts the issue on his list of important issues, which is maybe not on there at all or way at the bottom, because he mentioned all sorts of things, took lots of time to do off-the-cuff remarks, as he's wont to do as well. Went through practically everything you could imagine, had a bunch of surprise guests. It was almost like a reality TV show, I guess, which is fitting since he was a reality TV show host, but he had like a special guest come out every so often to give them, a shout out or an award or whatever. He handed out like a Medal of Honor during the State of the Union. Of course, he had heckling back and forth with the Democrats in the building as well. And but even with all that stuff, he still also had time, of course, to outline a bunch of policy areas that he wants action in, all across the board: immigration, the economy, tensions in the Middle East with Iran, all sorts of things he was able to touch on, as you might imagine, in a nearly 2-hour speech. He got a lot of time to talk about a lot of things. And it's notable, one, that it wasn't written into his speech, anything about gun policy. And there's a number of things he could have talked about, right? He could have, because at points, not only did he ask for Congress to do certain things on his policy agenda, but he also, celebrated his claimed accomplishments, right? And he could have done either of those things on guns. He could have talked about a number of the things that the administration has done on gun policy. I think to this point, he's actually been, the administration overall has been more active on gun policy than they were in his first administration, including a lot of things that his supporters like and the gun control activists like, right? He could have easily pointed to any number of those. The tax cut on silencers and short barrel rifles and shotguns that went into effect in January. He signed that. The Congress passed that. His various efforts to undo state or local gun restrictions through the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, suing localities like Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. over some of the way they've handled gun policy in recent years, including DC's assault weapons ban. There's any number of things he could have pointed to, and he just didn't do that. It wasn't written into the speech, which is notable. Like, his team did not put anything in there on this. And also, he didn't go off the cuff to mention anything on this, which is also very notable when it comes to this president in particular. He's fond of going off the cuff, doing the weave, I think, as he calls it, right? So the fact that it didn't come up anywhere in there means something, and I think it primarily means that it's just not, this issue is not top of mind for the president or his administration, or at least the people who write his speeches. The PR people don't want this to be not even a top not even just a top concern, but like anything in public at all. And that might actually be good to some degree, that he didn't go off the cuff at least to talk about this stuff for gun rights activists, because the last time he did were his comments attacking Alex Preddy, the man who was killed by immigration agents in Minneapolis last month while carrying a gun legally. He went and attacked him carrying that gun and implied that carrying extra magazine is nefarious, even though it's common practice among people who carry firearms legally. And that obviously drew quite a bit of concern and backlash from gun rights activists. The last time he talked about guns in public was that. So maybe it's better for that he didn't bring it up off the cuff. At least but certainly you might expect he might want to talk about this a little bit, or his team might want to put it in the speech, but apparently not. So, it's, as for what that means, I guess what we should take away from it, how much it matters. Did a whole piece for members trying to analyze that question. And, number one is what I just mentioned, right? It shows a lack of interest in the topic. It shows that the issue is not at the top of his priority lists by any means, or his administration's priority lists. It's just like we said during the campaign. It wasn't a top issue in the campaign. They didn't want to make it a top issue. And the president didn't have a personal priority to make that a top issue himself. And so unlike, for instance, Joe Biden used to go off the cuff and talk about guns pretty regularly. It's clearly something that he cared a lot about. Now, obviously, he was cared about it in the complete opposite direction of Donald Trump for the most part, right? The policy-wise, they were completely diametrically opposed on the issue. Biden, for the most part, wanted much stricter gun laws, whereas Trump, for the most part, has sought to loosen them. So, but it was something that Biden would bring up a lot. Trump he has historically talked about it, mostly to, as a way of talking about his record and claiming to be, the strongest defender of the Second Amendment and so forth. I think his actual record is obviously more mixed than that, though he does have certainly a number of accomplishments he can point to that make gun rights activists happy. And again, he could have done that in this speech and didn't. But yeah, beyond the sort of pricing in where guns fall on the totem pole, I don't know how much it changes things, because it seems so far in this administration, we've noticed a couple of things, right? One is the dichotomy between how they treat state and local gun restrictions, where they've been pretty aggressive at sometimes like that Washington, D.C. suit, unprecedented, like new things that they're trying here that administrations haven't done before. Most of the stuff they're doing through the Civil Rights Division on guns is brand new, right? I haven't seen that since, Reconstruction, right? The Freedmen's Bureau and some of the efforts made around the Second Amendment in that period. But then if you look at federal laws, it's a totally different approach, right? That's why in the same day, we had the Department of Justice filing a lawsuit against Washington, D.C.'s Sullivan's ban, claiming that their ban on the sale of AR-15s and similar guns was unconstitutional. Meanwhile, then going into court to defend a challenge against the federal Switchblade Act, which effectively bans the sale, interstate sale of switchblades, and saying that ban is not unconstitutional. So, AR-15s are protected, but pocket knives aren't under this formulation, essentially. And that gets at the state versus federal dichotomy, but I think it also gets at a larger issue, which is that much of gun policy under Donald Trump's second term seems to be less centrally coordinated and more a result of whatever personnel happens to be in different positions, right? Like Harmeet Dillon is the person who's been appointed to run the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. She's an assistant attorney general, and she was a former gun rights lawyer. And so she's doing a lot of things that gun rights activists like at the Civil Rights Division. And it seems entirely driven by the fact that that's her background and that she's the one in that position, not necessarily by a larger plan from the administration, right? Whereas you could look at Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., who has focused quite a lot on gun seizures, gun recoveries in her time in that position, also appointed by Donald Trump, right? And just got in a bunch of hot water because that focus on gun seizures has pushed into areas that gun rights activists are very uncomfortable with, using DC's extremely strict gun laws. DC has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation, as the Harmeet Dillon lawsuit shows. And Pirro is out not only using those laws, it seems, to the fullest extent, but also bragging about that and talking about how she's going to go after even law-abiding gun owners if they come into the city with a gun, even though that's actually can be legal, right? Because you can get a non-resident carry permit. But that created a whole firestorm among gun rights activists, and so it's just, I think, a product of whoever is in charge of a given division. The gun rights activists don't like Pam Bondi, for instance, Attorney General, because of her background with gun policy in Florida and backing a number of gun restrictions at the time. And, I would say she hasn't taken I wouldn't say DOJ has taken a very comprehensive effort to reform its approach to gun policy to be more in line with what gun rights activists want, right? Like, I think that's clear. Now, it hasn't necessarily gone the other way either. It seems like it's just a matter of certain sections of the DOJ, like the Civil Rights Division, are going one way, and other sections are, the Switchblade Act defense feels like more of a just business as usual sort of move, and less, intentionally done to aggravate Second Amendment activists, right? It's just like the DOJ is supposed to defend federal law, and so in this case they did. There was no effort to align the department's views of the law with gun rights activists like there has been at the Civil Rights Division. And so that's more the result. You have a different person there who's not doesn't have the background as a Second Amendment activist, and is, I think, just playing the traditional DOJ playbook of, we're supposed to defend federal laws. Here's how we're going to defend this law. And you've also seen that, of course, even at the Supreme Court with Hamani, which is coming up. Oral arguments are coming up soon, but you just did a overview of exactly what the government is arguing in that case, what the DOJ is arguing, and they're defending the weed and gun ban. So, that's what the takeaway is for me. I don't know that anything is going to change because of this speech, or there's a lack of mention of gun policy at the speech. It's more reinforcing what we've been seeing for the last 2 years, really, from Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And I think where we're at right now is there's less of a concerted effort by this administration on gun policy, even though, there's been things like the president's executive order that was telling, the DOJ to go through and look for any areas where it's not in line with the Second Amendment or a certain read of the Second Amendment. And but it seems much more like personnel is what's driving this sort of fractured approach to gun policy in the Trump administration. And I don't see anything like that changing. So anytime soon. And there are somewhere areas too where that can go beyond just business as usual, like some of these defenses of federal law. There's also things like the trans gun ban that was floated last year by anonymous officials at the Department of Justice. We don't know who they are, but we know that they suggested trying to ban people in some way from owning guns based on their gender identity. And that is one thing that came up in this speech, I would say, that pretends a potential risk of some sort of identity-based gun ban. And that's it wasn't directly gun related, of course, but Trump went after just Somalis in general for fraud. He singled out a nationality here, as he's done many times throughout his political career, with the Muslim ban and lots of different comments that single out groups of people based on some identity. And, it just raises the specter that could translate into gun policy. They did float the idea of doing that with the trans gun ban last year. And so that was another thing I took away from the speech, is that risk still exists, even though those comments were not in relation to gun policy directly. The president is clearly comfortable with trying to go after people based on some aspect of their identity. And that has already come up in the gun policy space and from part of his administration, and could come up again. And that's one of the long-term risks of having Donald Trump as president. So, gun rights activists were able to immediately pop that trial balloon back when the DOJ was floating it, or at least certain officials at the DOJ were floating it. And perhaps they could do that again with some other identity-based gun ban in the future, but and perhaps it won't come. It hasn't. The president himself hasn't actually suggested policy like that, so maybe he never will. Hopefully, he never will. But and I think the risk remains with Donald Trump around. Certainly there's this idea of personnel having an impact, and what personnel he puts in place being a catalyst for what his gun policies are going to be in various areas. But then there's also, that risk of him backing some new gun restriction, and with his popularity within the Republican Party remaining pretty high, even if his overall popularity is down into the 30s now. His approval rating in most recent polls is down into the mid 30s. There's a risk that if he did back some sort of gun restriction, that it could actually get passed. And I think that remains underrated, that could happen based on what we saw, not just with the Preddy comments, but also, his first term with take the guns first, due process second after Parkland. And obviously the bump stock ban happened, turned into real policy before being struck down by the Supreme Court. And then also he considered backing an assault weapons ban after the El Paso shooting behind closed doors. And so, that's always a possibility. I think it's mostly something to worry about around major mass shootings. Trump made those comments about Preddy, and then he kind of stopped talking about it. And he didn't bring it. The fact that he didn't bring it back up during the State of the Union is maybe a sign that he isn't fixated on that at this point. So probably more, if you're the risk factor for Donald Trump backing himself, any sort of gun control legislation would likely come after some sort of major mass shooting, which we have been lucky enough to avoid so far this year, and really have had quite a lull in major mass shootings the last couple of years. Hopefully that will continue, but yeah, obviously it remains a significant risk.
Yeah, certainly. Moving on beyond the State of the Union and gun politics, we have some updated reporting on the Epstein Files. Obviously, we published a few articles last week as well. But did a follow-up on some more gun-related content that were found in those Epstein Files, including the fact that after Jeffrey Epstein's first arrest and conviction for a sex crime, which obviously was a felony, and as such rendered him ineligible to possess or purchase firearms, show that, in the ensuing years, right up until he was arrested once again, he was pretty actively looking for ways to restore his gun rights and regain legal access to his apparently considerable collection of firearms.
Yeah, it's very strange to look through these files and see what he was doing around these key moments, because one thing that's revealed in the story that we found in these email exchanges that were released by the Department of Justice is that he literally the day before the Miami Herald published its expose that brought attention back to the allegations against Epstein and eventually led to his arrest and then his death in prison the next year. The day before that story came out, he was crafting a letter to send to the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands, who he appears to have had a pretty close relationship with. CNN just had a story on other aspects of his relationship with the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands at the time. This was back in 2018. But he was crafting this letter, he's trying to get his lawyers put together a letter to ask the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands to pardon him, or to it seemed like this was a years-long campaign to try and get his gun rights back, to try and figure out how he could own guns again, especially on the island. He wanted to carry guns on the island where he carried out most of his, or a lot of his sexual abuse of underage girls. And so, he spent years trying to figure out how to get his gun rights back despite his felony conviction. And to the point where he's on the day before that Miami Herald piece comes out, he's talking to his lawyers about how this letter he wants to send to the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands to try and get his gun rights back. And then when he's told by his lawyers that actually the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands can't pardon him for crimes he committed in Florida, and he doesn't have the ability to do rights restoration for him or anything, he kept seemed to be getting increasingly desperate to try and figure out a way to get his gun rights back. And he seemed to have help to some degree from actually the first lady of the U.S. Virgin Islands at the time, the governor's wife. And her name is Cecile de Jong, I believe is how it's pronounced. But, she actually worked for Epstein for a period of time, according to the Washington Post. And there are emails between him and her that go back to actually 2013, where he's trying to figure out the rules for carrying a gun for a felon, which the rule would be you can't carry a gun as a felon. The U.S. or Virgin Islands are part of, the United States, and federal laws apply there. And so, but Epstein was trying to figure this out, and this woman, Cecile de Jong, was trying to help him with that, checking with the police department. She had previously helped him, or at least updated him on getting guns for his employees on the island. The island seems to have had guns on it during basically his entire time as a convicted felon. Now they were perhaps in the possession of other people on the island, staff members on the island, although that raised sort of legal questions as well. Actually, is one of the reasons that Epstein kept pushing his lawyers to try and find a way for him to get his rights back, is because here's one thing he said to one of his lawyers. He said, quote, "If the person carrying the gun is an employee, there might be an issue." And that was in response to his lawyer saying that the governor can't pardon him for this crime in Florida. And he said, "This is not a pardon. It is a restoration of a civil right." It's that it seems like he got that idea as well from a report that he had a different set of lawyers put together for whether it would be legal for staff who lived on his island to have their own personal guns, which the the lawyers in that case, in that situation, concluded that the residents, like the staff, could have guns on the island, but it would become an issue if the employer was directing what they could do with those guns at all in any way. So, it definitely seems like there were, he was right up on the line of what's legal, perhaps in this case, maybe over the line, given some of the other evidence that we've gathered. Haven't finished all of these stories yet. But he was, this was not the only, evidence of him sort of, as we put in our timeline, our members piece that has the timeline of every single sort of mention of guns in the Epstein files that relate to, Jeffrey Epstein. There were numerous times where after his conviction, he seems to be involved in what's going on with guns on his properties and guns technically owned by his staff or what have you. So, this is certainly one of those times. But bottom line with this story, and it's not, we can't get into every detail of it on the show. We don't have enough time for that, of course. But he's the record here shows that we've revealed shows him continually trying to get his gun rights back, right up to literally the night before that Miami Herald piece drops. And then actually he continued this push after it came out, up to like a couple of days before a new investigation was opened into him. And he seemed to be increasingly desperate. He asks at one point whether or not the governor of the Virgin Islands can just exempt him from the laws. He said, but doesn't he have the right to exempt one from any VI law, Virgin Island law, is what Epstein appears to have emailed his lawyer. And I will say his lawyer, even though she told him pretty directly that here's what she says, quote, "There is no option for expungement available to you, as the governor can only expunge local law violations. There's also no option for a pardon, as he can only pardon violations of local law." But she continued and said, "We're trying to figure out a way the governor to push through a license to have a gun on the property because of exigent circumstances or some other similar reason. We're working on it, but let's talk in the morning." So it's also not clear what came of any of this stuff. I assume it got dropped because this was, again, those were sent after the Miami Herald piece came out, those particular emails. So the heat was back on Epstein, and he was arrested, I believe, just about 7 months after this happened, in July of 2019. So, and when the FBI searched his island, they did find guns. They found 2 Glocks on the island, and this comes back into the poor redactions, the sort of erratic way these files have been released, because those Glocks have names next to them on the evidence sheet, and in 2 copies of that file they're redacted, and in another one they're not. I couldn't find any evidence of who these names are, or whether it meant that those guns belong to those the people named there or not. But just further, and that last email exchange was very jumbled in the records. I think I've fairly laid out what the exchange was, but the records are pieced together in a pretty sloppy way in some cases. But either way, more evidence of what Epstein was doing around firearms. He claimed to be scared to be on his island. He was claiming there were drug boats around, at least at one point. But it was sort of a sick irony, I guess, of it, that he was afraid to be on his island without a gun while he was allegedly abusing many, upwards of 1,000, apparently, young women and girls on his island. So just further insight into the whole Epstein saga and how it crosses over into our area of coverage, with firearms.
Certainly. And, speaking of our area of coverage and all the work you've been doing, sort of parsing through these files, it's least starting to get a little bit of attention outside of just the Reload, right? Because we saw a gun rights group, the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, put out a statement citing your reporting in last week's newsletter, in particular related to like the previously uncovered connections between Michael Bloomberg and Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein himself, putting out a statement, calling for more scrutiny into what you uncovered. We linked to it in the newsletter links this week as well.
Yeah, and they're calling for Everytown, which Bloomberg funded and co-founded and has been the primary funder for, to stop taking donations from him. I don't think Everytown has responded to that, and Bloomberg still hasn't responded to any of this news. Haven't put out any statement about his connections to Epstein or how often he was personally visiting with him or personally met with him, or whether he went to that private invitation to Epstein's house or not. We don't know. There's lots of unanswered questions. That's what you get in these files, right? Is a lot of evidence, but a lot of it just leads to unanswered questions. I mean, even this story that we're talking about here, right? We have evidence that Epstein kept trying to get his gun rights restored, including not just in the Virgin Islands, but he said he was going to look into getting his gun rights restored in Florida. But we don't have any indication as to if any of that ever actually happened, if this letter ever got sent, if the De Jongs, for instance, ever actually took any effort to help him get his gun rights back, if the Florida government got involved in any way. We don't know. Some of these, first off, while there's millions of these files, not everything has been released, as we've seen recently with President Trump and some of the allegations against him that were in there that there's evidence that they are part of these files and just haven't been released by the Department of Justice, which has been under fire from victims and others for how they've handled the release, including from the congressman who co-sponsored the bill that's requiring DOJ to release this information. So we don't necessarily have a full record of exactly what happened. We have a lot of information, but not all of it. And so oftentimes what you come away with at the end of these stories is, if you're being responsible about this stuff, at least, is more questions perhaps than answers, unfortunately. And so, yeah, there are a number of questions that Michael Bloomberg probably should answer and hasn't. So we'll see what develops on that front. And we'll obviously continue to press for answers and report on this, regardless of how anyone feels about it, right? Whether it's Bloomberg or other billionaires we've been implicated in our stories too, like Tom Pritzker, all right, from Hyatt Hotels, or recently retiring from the position at Hyatt Hotels over his connection to Epstein. But yeah, there's quite a lot of people. We did obviously reach out to Cecil De Jong, who was mentioned a number of times in our story for comment. We didn't hear anything back. And as well, the lawyer that is mentioned a number of times, she didn't reply either. So we make an effort to get the answers, but best we can do is present the evidence as it exists and not try to embellish or sensationalize it. And if there's unanswered questions, we'll strive to answer them, but we can only do that with evidence.
Yeah, certainly. Switching gears a little bit here, we had a slight bit of Supreme Court news this week. I mean, there's a lot of gun-related cases that I think our listeners and a lot of gun rights advocates have been eagerly waiting to get some answers on, and those didn't come this week, unfortunately. But one case where we did get a little bit of a resolution was in the sort of part 2 saga of the NRA's free speech case against the former financial regulator out of New York. The Supreme Court actually declined to take the NRA's case to rehear and review the Second Circuit's qualified immunity ruling in that instance. And so that, for all intents and purposes, kind of ends the NRA's attempt to get some sort of remuneration for what the Supreme Court previously ruled was probably a First Amendment violation.
Yeah, and this is one that we predicted, right, at the time. This is something we talked about back, I think, even during the Supreme Court, when they did take up the case, because this was something you could see coming, because the question that the NRA presented, they actually presented 2 questions in the first case. And the first question was about whether or not, Maria Volo's actions, alleged actions at least. This was obviously the court reviewed this at a very early stage of the case, so the NRA didn't have to prove the allegations at that point. But they had to. The question was whether or not, if the allegations were true, would that be a First Amendment violation? And that's where the Supreme Court was unanimous in agreeing that yes, it would, if these allegations are true. And that was the first question. The second question was whether or not she should enjoy the protections of qualified immunity, which is what the lower court had held. The court held the first time around, the Second Circuit said, hey, no, these aren't violations of the First Amendment, even if the allegations are true. And then it went on to say, and even if they are violations, the Vulu would be protected by qualified immunity because it's not clearly established that this stuff is a First Amendment violation, right? That's supposed to be the concept of qualified immunity. Is protect government officials in situations where there's sort of a gray area about what they're doing, whether or not it's unconstitutional. This is obviously a highly controversial doctrine that the Supreme Court has struggled with for years now. But yes, so when the Supreme Court accepted this case and only took up the first question, not the second question, I think it was fairly clear, even from that point, that this NRA was unlikely to win any sort of practical punishment for Vulu or any sort of restitution from her on their part. And so they won like a moral victory here. I mean, it's still a win to get a unanimous ruling in your favor at the Supreme Court, but it's more of a symbolic one because it doesn't help them in practical sense. They're not getting restitution for the damage that was caused by Vulu's unconstitutional pressure on these insurers, which did force, allegedly at least, a lot of this stuff has still not been necessarily proven in court, but the allegations are that these major insurers broke ties with the NRA over this unconstitutional pressure from Vulu, and therefore that obviously would cost the NRA a lot of time and money to try and replace these insurers they were working with. And so now we've come back around, and the Second Circuit did exactly what you'd expect when they got the case back from the Supreme Court, which is they said, okay, fine, it's a First Amendment violation, but she's still protected by qualified immunity, as we said the first time around. Even if it is a violation, she doesn't face any real world consequences for it. I guess the idea is the next official who does something very similar to this. That's one of the big problems with qualified immunity, right? That's one of the big critiques of it is that you have to do like almost exactly the thing that the previous official had done before you can be held liable in any way for it. Your unconstitutional actions, right? So anyway, maybe the next person who tries something like this will get in real trouble, but this time around, she's protected by qualified immunity, and there's no real recourse for the NRA in getting any sort of restitution. Their constitutional rights were violated, but oh well, is kind of the message you're left with from this. And that's was effectively what the Second Circuit ruled, and now, like you wrote in your story, as a result of the Supreme Court deciding not to take up the case, that's the ruling that's going to stand. And there's no further, I don't believe there's any further recourse, right?
Yeah, no, there's nowhere else for this to go. That was sort of their last chance, was to get the Supreme Court to weigh in to kind of let this continue going down the process. And like you said, the conclusion basically is, yeah, well, First Amendment was violated, but too bad, so sad. And the NRA put like a little bit of a positive gloss on it. They put out a statement from Doug Hamlin, who's the new EVP, basically saying, we're disappointed they didn't take up our case, but at least now with this previous Supreme Court ruling, public officials are on notice going forward that future instances of this, what they call job owning, where like a public official tries to use pressure to prevent someone from doing business with a disfavored political group, these people are on notice that they can't get away with that. So they're at least they're holding on to the symbolic sort of forward-looking portion of this, rather than the fact that they're not going to get a single penny for what was ostensibly a constitutional violation.
Right. Here's his quote. Well, actually, let me start with here's the quote from the Second Circuit. Here's what the actual direct quote of what they ruled. quote, although the NRA plausibly alleged a First Amendment claim, we conclude that Vooloo is entitled to qualified immunity because the First Amendment rights asserted were not clearly established at the time of the challenged conduct. Reasonable officials in Vooloo's position would not have known for certain, based on the cases cited above, that her conduct crossed the line from forceful but permissible persuasion to impermissible coercion and retaliation. And then here's the part of the Hamlin quote that you're alluding to is, quote, this landmark decision puts every public official on unmistakable notice that they cannot weaponize their regulatory power to suppress or punish lawful speech, and those who try will face serious legal consequences. So, yeah, you're right. And they did say, he also said, we are disappointed that the Supreme Court declined to review the Second Circuit's opinion on qualified immunity. Although presumably they should have seen that coming, given what we've discussed. This all goes back, for anyone who doesn't recall, to Vooloo's sending out guidance letters that said companies should take the reputational risk of working with the NRA into consideration when deciding whether or not to do business with them. And then also there were alleged to be private meetings she held with executives at two major insurers that were working with the NRA, where she essentially told them that if they dropped their relationship with the NRA, she would go easier on them in other areas. But effectively saying, because of, and this was all done explicitly because of the NRA's political opinions on firearms. So that was the allegations, at least against her in this case, and what the Second Circuit and I guess the Supreme Court now agreeing to, it's not a ruling on the Supreme Court's part, but they are letting the lower ruling stand that essentially said, no, she couldn't have known that those actions were unconstitutional. Apparently, telling one of the companies she regulates that if it drops business with one of her political opponents, that they will receive preferential treatment in other areas going forward. Apparently, was not a clear.
Could have known.
Yes. So I guess now they'll know that if they do that, now officials will know if they do something like that in the future, they'll actually get in trouble for it. But anyway, as we said, this is something we saw coming, and I think should have been fairly clear it was going to happen from the get-go of this case, at least once the Supreme Court accepted just the first question, especially since this court has been fairly amenable to a broad reading of qualified immunity in the past.
Yeah, they have not seemed to be willing to rein that in whatsoever. So, like you said, prediction came true. But speaking of the Supreme Court, getting into some of our newsletter links this week, we have another gun group trying to get the Supreme Court to take up a case, this time the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the trade group for the gun industry. They are trying to get the High Court to review New York's public nuisance, basically what you might call their attempt to circumvent the PLCAA. New York was sort of a pioneer in this, becoming one of the first states in recent years to adopt one of these public nuisance statutes to try to create its own state law that these gun companies may or may not violate, that then they can use that to shoehorn through what's called the predicate exception in the PLCAA, which says that gun companies can't be immune from suits where there's a violation of law. And so obviously the industry sees this just as a sort of a veneer over what's just a scheme to circumvent federal law. But so far, lower courts have been really hesitant to strike down these laws. And a lot of times these suits have just been dismissed. So this is another, potential high stakes PLCAA gun industry liability related case that if the justices have the appetite for, could be a big deal, because a lot more states since New York have gone on to adopt similar statutes because this has become a popular trend in the gun control movement. Yeah,
Virginia's considering one right now. As well.
That's right.
We talked about that on the interview podcast last week with Virginia Citizens Defense League's Philip Van Cleve. That's one of the policies that they're considering, and you're right, it is becoming a pretty popular law for your triple blue states to pass. So pretty high stakes case here, in theory at least, for that aspect of gun policy, which has become much more active in the last 10 years after gun control activists have tried to find ways around that legal protection from that federal law for a long time, and they've had some success with it. And that's where these state laws are coming into play to try and give further ammunition to go after the gun industry. So
Yep,
we'll have
certainly.
to see if the Supreme Court does anything on it, though.
It's true. It's just one more gun related case piling up on their doorstep that they, at least for a lot of them, they have yet to make a decision on. But we will, of course, let everyone know once they do decide what they're going to do. But speaking of state laws, the last newsletter link we want to touch on comes to us from a local outlet out in West Virginia, because lawmakers in West Virginia have introduced a pretty novel, what you might call pro-gun, boundary-pushing pro-gun piece of legislation that seeks to find a way to sell post-1986 machine guns to normal civilians.
Yeah, certainly an eye-catching proposal here. Basically a way to circumvent the Hughes Amendment, which cut off sales of new, effectively cut off sales of new machine guns to civilians in 1986. And so this proposal would take advantage of one of the exemptions in that rule, which is that states are not restricted by this. And so the theory here is that states can still sell machine guns to civilians if they want to. And that's what this policy is proposing. And I think it's a good story to talk about, not just because it's kind of an interesting pushing of the boundaries out there. And we've already seen it replicated in, I think it was Kentucky, there's been a bill put up in Kentucky on this same idea. And it's just kind of an interesting hypothetical here, something that could go somewhere maybe, but also, I think this is an important story to discuss for why we have the reload. One of the reasons, right? Whenever I talk about why I founded the reload, I talk about that sort of sweet spot that we're in, where we're both informed on guns and on politics, right? Because oftentimes major media outlets are not very well informed on guns or the gun laws or how they work and so on and so forth. You see a lot of even super basic mistakes made in major media outlets about like semi-automatic versus fully automatic, which this story touches on a little bit, obviously. But also you see a lot of mistakes in gun media, where gun media often, they know a lot about guns, certainly, and how they function, often more than I know, in terms of like the muzzle velocity of, 308 through a 20-inch barrel or whatever. Like, I don't know that off the top of my head. There's a lot of people who do that are great working in gun media, but they often don't, they often fall short on politics and how they work. And you will often see people talk about bills like this one, especially like eye-catching bills, in either direction. Honestly, usually comes in the other direction, where it's like, some, backbench person in a deep blue state introduced some crazy bill. And it has no chance of passing, but you will often see it talked about like it has already passed because somebody introduced it, right? And that happens with bills like this too, where it's like, all right, this bill got introduced in West Virginia. Now, it was introduced by 2 Republican members of their Senate, where Republicans control the Senate. And so maybe that means it has a real chance of passing, although I do think the idea of having the state police sell machine guns to people is going to be fairly controversial, even in a place like West Virginia, honestly. Like, we'll see. It's certainly possible, because you actually talked about this in recent months, that some of these triple red states are kind of running out of gun policy that they can pursue, right? They have all of the like permitless carry, every gun rights protection that is mainstream in the gun rights movement. They've already implemented it. So some of these places, some of these politicians who want to prove their pro-gun bona fides are, they're looking for ways to do that and with new policy. And so maybe that will happen here. I don't know. but it had, this has just been introduced is the point that I get across. It is an interesting policy because it's different. There is some potential that it could pass because it's got 2 co-sponsors from the party that controls the Senate, and I believe also the whole of government in West Virginia, right? It's a triple red state at the moment. I don't know what the margins are there off the top of my head, but if they have huge margins, it's obviously have a better chance of passing. But still, it's a new idea. That's one that a lot of gun rights activists, especially online activists who watch a lot of like machine gun related content on YouTube, for instance, and enjoy, want to have one for themselves. I understand the impulse, certainly, especially because buying machine guns after the Hughes Amendment has become an insanely expensive proposition in the 5 to 6 figures for most of them. So this would, of course, something like this becoming popular would really crash the machine gun market. So if you own machine guns as like an investment, which some people do, maybe watch out for this. But it is one of those things where it's like, it is an interesting enough thing to talk about, but it's important to get across that this is not actual policy yet, and it may never become policy, even in a place like West Virginia. We'll keep an eye on it, certainly, but this hits one of those one of those areas that like it kind of started the Reload to push back against them and make sure people are understanding what's actually going on, instead of being misinformed by other people who don't know as much about these processes, right? So, West Virginia, we'll see what happens. Kentucky, we'll see if these go anywhere. There is some potential, right? As you talked about there a lot of these Republicans out there in states that have everything on the gun rights wish list are looking for ways to try and prove their bona fide. So maybe this will be the one, and we'll all be driving to West Virginia to buy our machine guns in the near future. Because it seems to me that the bill would allow people from out of state to buy either as well, because it's just anyone who can legally possess it in West Virginia. And that would include probably neighbors like me in Virginia, perhaps. I don't know. We'll have to see exactly what where this goes and whether and how, if it passes. I think we'll certainly do. If it gets, we'll follow this story certainly. But I just want to make it clear where things are actually at today, and explain like the realities of it is all. But yeah, interesting proposal, certainly.
Absolutely. And it's important clarification. We always want to try to be realistic with our listeners when these bills come up. To me, for now, anyways, this is more interesting in the fact that maybe it tips its hat where the gun rights movement's thinking as they're looking at those outer edges of policy and they're looking for new things to do. But it doesn't yet say what is going to be law with an absolute certainty. I don't, by any means, neither of us want to give the impression that this is a sure slam dunk thing. But of course, like you said, we'll cover it if it does.
It's definitely it's policy innovation, right? We haven't seen a proposal like this before that tries to take advantage of some of the common exceptions left in these gun laws, right? Oftentimes, the state and law enforcement are exempted from pretty much every gun restriction you could imagine, right? So, if you're in a particularly pro-gun state, why not try to take advantage of those exemptions, I guess, is the concept here, right? In theory, I suppose a state could sell a machine gun. The laws has an exception for state ownership of machine guns. Well, we'll have to work through obviously the text. Perhaps we'll have to look a bit closer at it too, and talk to some experts. If it catches any momentum, I think we'll probably do that, right? Like, would this actually withstand a legal challenge? Now, you also happen to have an ATF and a DOJ that is more likely to be on your side in something like this now. Right now although it goes back to our conversation earlier about personnel, although one of the personnel that's key in gun policy at the moment right now is the ATF chief counsel, Robert Leiter, right? Who's the former Second Amendment scholar from George Mason University. He's been on this show a number of times. He wrote for the Reload before he went into the ATF, and he's pursued efforts to try and loosen some of the restrictions around guns, kind of with a more long-term vision, I think, in mind of like changing things that it would be much harder to change back. They're not necessarily always the splashiest moves, but they're things that may stick around past the next 3 years. So anyway, point is, maybe I'm sure there are legal questions that will have to be answered, and we'll have to take a closer look if this gets further along in the process of passing the legislature in West Virginia. But it's certainly an interesting concept, that's for sure. But yeah, I think that's all we got news-wise this week. We're going to be talking to, it should be an interesting podcast. I'm going to try to have 3 guests at once, and I don't know how that's going to translate. But look for that. We've done 2 in the past, right? 2 guests. This week, it's a new coalition group on gun policy that has a number of people from, we're going to have Rob Pincus, and then I think his name is Lowry. He's actually the guy who left Brady to go and start his own group that was representing Mexico in their suit against the gun industry that lost at the Supreme Court recently, right? But they're part of this new group or coalition that's trying to put out gun policy. So speaking of innovation, I guess, in gun policy, they're advocating for a collection of new proposals that try to bridge, I guess, the gap and cross that, free up the stagnation that we've had over the last 30 years in the gun policy debate. So we're going to have them on with the professor, Rob Pincus, by the way. He's been on the show before as well. He's a activist who owns a gun company. He's a gun safety instructor. He's one of the people who was heavily involved in the NRA reform movement, especially towards the beginning of it. So they have put together some interesting members. Usually these sorts of things are just like, I think they have a reputation, like these compromise groups or whatever, for basically just being gun control groups with better marketing, I guess, or different marketing approach. I feel like is how a lot of gun owners view a lot of these things, that every town has a literal gun owner group as part of it. But this seems to be a bit different, which is why we're exploring what they're talking about. And their policy proposals also are different. That's one of the things that's been, I think, lacking in the past, is like every town has a gun owner group, but they just support all the same policies that every town supports. So it's not really, I don't know. It's never really caught any momentum with gun owners, it doesn't seem. So we'll have these guests on 3. This will be 4 people, and see how I can manage that, and whether hopefully we can get some productive conversation and get some actual insight into what they're proposing. But that's the interview podcast for this week. Members will get access on Sunday, and everyone else will have access on Monday, of course. You have any fun plans for the weekend, by the way?
Yeah, wife and I are going up to the mountains to go visit her in-laws just for the weekend. So be spending a little bit of time up in the Colorado mountains. So it's nice. A little bit of work, but also at least visiting some family.
That'll be fun. Get out in the wilderness a little bit. I guess I'll have to watch Flyers hockey now that the good hockey is over. So that's kind of disappointing. Although we did win in overtime last night. Matvei Michkov, the potential superstar who's not panned out so far, did score the game-winning goal in overtime against the Rangers, which is always nice, even though the Flyers have no chance practically of making the playoffs at this point. And we're coming off watching 2 of the greatest hockey performances in American history at the Olympics. I mean, my God, those game-winning goals from both of those teams were incredible. What a performance from the American hockey teams. The women's team, I'd say obviously a little more of they were not an underdog going into that game, I don't think. You're right. They're the dominant team in international hockey, deservedly so. They're insanely talented, and I think we talked about at the time, right? The overtime goal is probably one of the best goals I've ever
Cool,
seen
yeah.
to win like an Olympic game. Even more impressive than Crosby's golden gold all those years ago. And then the American men, like Jack Hughes having his teeth busted out and scoring that goal in overtime. Just amazing that Hellebuck, his performance,
Yeah, stood on his head.
Yeah, only really the reason they won, right? But yeah, Hughes and that picture of him with the flag, very, very 1980 American. Yeah, it reminded me of Bobby Clark, actually, the Flyers in the 70s. Even though I wasn't alive for that, it's he has that old school hockey player look to him in that picture for sure, with his busted up teeth and this big smile, big bloody smile, and the American flag wrapped around. Beautiful stuff. It's unfortunate drama that's come after, thanks to politics getting mixed in. The FBI director, for some reason, showing up at the celebration on our taxpayer dime. So that's cool. I mean, whatever. We don't want to ruin the fun with talking about any of that stuff, but super proud of those two teams. Annoyed that they don't sell jerseys. I don't know if you know this, but they don't sell the jerseys. I assume this is a Fanatics thing because I can't stand Fanatics, and they run the entire jersey industry as a giant monopoly, which we're allowing for some insane reason. But if you go and try to buy the American jerseys through any official route, you can't. They don't sell them, men's or women's. It's bizarre. They sell T-shirts, which is something, I guess. But like, why can't I buy a Connor Hellebuck jersey with the American? I mean, that's the first gold medal since 1980 for the men. The women have been a little bit more successful over the years, but still, that's huge accomplishment to have these two teams winning gold. Like, why can't you buy the jerseys? Now, luckily, you can buy knockoffs, which is exactly what I did for me and my wife. I bought a Hellebuck jersey for me and the Keller jersey for her. Keller is the one who scored that overtime winner. So hopefully they look okay when they get here. They were only like $30. So I don't know how that's going to turn out, but that was the only option. So why are we not selling these jerseys? Anyway. All right. Well, that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.
No, the devil's got no